Good morning and welcome to today's event. You'll just give us a moment for everyone to load into our Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to today's event. This is our second event looking at the impact of Russian sanctions on trade. If you missed the first one earlier this month, it is on our website and on our YouTube page. Before we turn to today's event, I want to flag several upcoming events we'll be having on sanctions and the war in Ukraine, all of which we will link to in the chat. Next Thursday, April 7th, we have a great panel gathering online to discuss global food security issues arising out of the sanctions and the war in Ukraine. And the following week, April 14th, we'll be examining the implications of the moves by the US, Canada, the UK, and others to block imports of Russian energy and what that may mean for trade and climate change. We've also heard from a lot of you who want to do more for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. In the spirit of giving back to the global community, we are all part of the trade community we are all part of at WITA. We have created a joint fundraiser with the World Central Kitchen to help feed refugees and the people in Ukraine. We link to it in the event program you received this morning, and we'll share that link here as well. Of course, many of you are already doing what you can to support Ukraine, but if you want to join members of our trade community in supporting the people there, we hope you'll join us. If you've been watching any of our 120 webinars over the past 2 years, will you like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them here today? So welcome today to Jean-Yves Remy at UMI in Barbados, Elaine Feldman at the University of Ottawa, Ragnar Olsen at the Ministry of Trade in Oslo, and Roberto Di Stefani at the European Central Bank. Welcome, Jean-Yves, Elaine, Ragnar, Roberta, and welcome to all of you. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can toward the end of our session. You should have also received a copy of today's event program by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions and move right to our event today. First of all, it's a pleasure to welcome back to the WITA stage Simon Evenett. Simon was a guest on our very first ever COVID and trade webinar on March 26, 2020. He's been back since then, but when we look back at the 120 webinars we've done since March 2020, I have to tip my hat to Simon, who helped kick us off on this run. Welcome back, Simon. It's also a distinct pleasure to welcome Cecilia Malmström, the former European Commissioner for Trade. Cecilia and I spoke together on a panel about TTIP in Brussels in 2014, when protesters were calling TTIP the new NAFTA. Well, Cecilia, we now have a new NAFTA, so maybe we can get a new TTIP. In all seriousness, though, the US and the EU have many aligned goals today, and hopefully coming out of this terrible tragedy caused by Russia, a renewed spirit of transatlantic unity can bring us together on trade as well. I'm also pleased to welcome another new guest to the WITA Zoom stage, Professor Douglas Irwin at Dartmouth College. Doug is the author of the definitive book on US trade policy, Clashing Over Commerce, the History of US Trade Policy. I've been trying to get Doug on the WITA event for years, so I'm especially glad to have you here today. Welcome, Doug. And lest I forget my dear friend, Ambassador Rufus Yerxa. Rufus, I can't count the number of times that you've been on the WITA webinar circuit. It's easily more than a dozen over the past couple of years. It's always an honor and a pleasure to welcome you, especially to talk about today's topic, the impact of what's happening today on the world trading system, which you were present at the creation of, at least in the case of the WTO, if not the GATT. So welcome, Simon, Cecilia, Doug, and Rufus.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, and thank you for welcoming us. I might mention this is my first WITA webinar since my new affiliation with McClarty Associates. I know the McClarty team has been heavily involved with you at WITA, and I hope that that will continue, and I look forward to being part of it. And welcome to all the panelists. I want to just start with a few introductory points to set up our conversation, and then I'll turn to each of you for some discussion. You know, it's obvious that Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is a massive geopolitical shock, but it also has unleashed a chain of events with far-reaching economic consequences. And as you all know, Russia is the 11th largest world economy, a major energy exporter, also important in other sectors like minerals and agriculture. And it's also become an integral player in the institutional structure for economic cooperation, a status that many in the West are perhaps now regretting. After all, it's only been 9 years since Russia's WTO accession, and it's already become the first WTO country to invade a fellow member. Putin has been a pretty malignant force in world events for a long time, but it took this invasion for the democratic world to finally say enough. And now a coalition of almost 40 countries has moved to implement sweeping financial sanctions and trade restrictions. Europe is moving to reduce dependency on Russian energy. Moscow has been cut off from Western currency and capital markets. Multinational companies are leaving in droves. It's hard to say what immediate impacts these measures will have on Putin's misadventure in Ukraine, but they clearly separate Russia from the free world in a way not seen since the height of the Cold War. But other big economies continue to support Russia with trade and investment. China has maintained its strategic alliance and trade and economic ties. It's condemned the sanctions, and it's actually blamed NATO for creating the tensions. On the other hand, it has resisted, at least so far, Moscow's request for military assistance, and it's called on both sides to settle the matter peacefully. So this indicates to me China's awareness of the tightrope it's walking between its biggest strategic ally and its biggest export markets. And other countries, India, Brazil, and some other developing countries with traditional ties to Moscow have remained neutral and refrained from sanctions. So these developments raise major questions about how the war will shake up global economic alignments. The CEO of BlackRock recently said he foresees a major turn away from globalization as growing geopolitical divisions drive multinationals further towards localization, a trend perhaps already underway because of recent trade wars and COVID and other things. Many see this as a new economic iron curtain between market democracies and autocratic states, and they have growing doubts about such radically differing governing philosophies coexisting in a common framework of trade norms. But separating them is easier said than done. The West may now be ready to excise Russia from world trade, at least for a period of time, but a divorce from China and in systems like the WTO presents a much different and more complex scenario. So I'm hoping this distinguished panel can give us some insights, both about the impact of the various measures imposed against Russia as they ripple through global markets, and about the longer term impact on the WTO and other pillars of multilateral trade. I also hope we can put this in some historical context, looking back perhaps at the evolution of the former GATT system during the Cold War and ask what that can teach us about the present crisis. So what I'd like to do is start maybe just with some discussion about the economic impact of what's already happened before we get to the more systemic issues. And Simon, if I could ask you to give us your perspective on these multitude of sanctions, what the breakdown of trade and investment with Russia means, and how it will affect economic growth and trade in some key sectors, but also, you know, the obvious secondary and tertiary effects of these sanctions on others because of the way sanctions work. So Simon, why don't you start us out, and then I'll turn to Cecilia after you.
Thanks, Rufus, and it's great to be back. I think the first point is that the financial sanctions are having much more bite than the trade sanctions are. This is a standard finding in analyses of sanctions in the past. It's true this time as well. The financial sanctions are not just important in sort of freezing the central bank assets of Russia, which is very important, but it's also causing a lot of shipping companies and freight forwarders not even to touch any goods going in and out of Russia. And so the ability to ship stuff to and from Russia is actually breaking down. But that transport cost effect is probably much more important than the tariffs which have been threatened on imported goods from Russia. In fact, if you turn to the latter, in work I did with Mark Mundler a couple of weeks ago, we estimated that if the G7 and the EU were to emulate Canada's 35% across the board tariffs, then Russian GDP would, over the medium term, fall by about 1%, which is less than a third of the benefits that Russia got from joining the WTO, according to the World Bank. So so the G7 and the EU can only eat in to about a third of those systemic benefits, which Russia has derived. Why is that so small? Because only half of Russia's exports now go to the G7 and the EU, and that's 10 percentage points lower than what it was 10 years ago. And I think this then speaks to your third-party effects. We are seeing some countries getting great deals on Russian oil and gas. India is reported to have got a great deal on this. And so we are seeing trade being diverted, and we'll see more of that diversion to countries outside the G7 and the EU. Now, I'd be happy to go on and talk about the impacts on food and the like, but I don't know if you want to cover that now or later.
Why don't you say a couple words about it, Simon? Because I know you've done a recent paper that you circulated.
Yeah. So I think we're seeing essentially 4 sets of responses by governments. The headline one you've read a lot about in the newspapers is governments putting in place export bans and export controls on food and fertilizer, mainly cereals and fertilizer. We estimate there's at least 31 of those bans which have been put in place since the invasion began. And interestingly, a lot of them have been put in place on countries which are on the land route to the Mediterranean. The Black Sea route for shipping food out of or wheat out of Ukraine is now blocked. So the land route, which was the other route for getting stuff to the to the Mediterranean, that is where the action is. The second response is some countries are lowering tariffs on imported food. So we see Brazil doing this, Fiji doing this, Philippines thinking about doing this. The third thing is we're beginning to see subsidies ramping up for certain types of food production. We see that in the EU, but also in countries like Malawi have introduced this. And the final effect we're seeing in the food area is rationing. So we've begun to see rationing in Spain and in Greece in supermarkets, and governments have allowed this rationing of food to begin. So I think that really speaks to very profound effects in the area of food. And as we know, food security is very, very linked to political instability. And this is one of these really adverse knock-on effects from this particular invasion.
Great, that's a great start, Simon. Thank you very much. And Cecilia, turn to you next. I know, as a former EU trade commissioner and a prominent thinker on multilateralism, I thought maybe you could touch a bit on Europe's reaction to all this and how this has impacted the thinking within the EU and its members, who are also, of course, NATO members, but also, looking a little at what does this mean for the multilateral system? Is this a major inflection point for the democracies and how they react? Does it draw them closer together? And if so, what implications could that have? The divisions and also the greater unity for the WTO system and multilateralism generally.
Well, thank you for that, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and an honor to talk about these very difficult and complex questions as the terrible war in Ukraine enters now its 6th week. I want to make a few short points. The EU has reacted with unprecedented unity and speed to impose far-reaching sanctions, to isolate Russia economically, but also politically, culturally, scientifically, etc. There's been a massive humanitarian assistance and also military assistance from the peace facility. So lots of internal paradigm in the EU has changed in only 1 month. But it has led to the EU for now more united, more stronger than in a very long time, if ever. It has also led to NATO being stronger than ever and the transatlantic partnership stronger than in a very long time. There has been more calls and video conferences between Brussels and Washington the last month and in the last 6 years, I would say. And this is, of course, something that could build upon a more trustful, closer cooperation within the Transatlantic Trade and Tech Council, for instance, which will meet in May later. But of course, there are lots of challenges of this unity as well. The 4 million refugees, the economic restart was supposed to start after the COVID. And now, of course, with food prices, with energy prices, inflation rocketing in some countries such as Spain and others, this will put a lot of pressure internally for the EU. So what does this mean for trade? Well, Russia is not a very important trading partner for the EU, so those isolated effects will not be very big. And the EU had already before the crisis started to redirect its trade policy a little bit towards more level playing field issues. Of course, in general terms, but very much targeted vis-a-vis China when it comes to anti-coercion, mirror clauses, trade defense issues, investment screening, international procurement instrument, and so on. All individually make sense, but as a whole, they give a picture of a much more protectionist EU because they're not balanced with openness. There are trade agreements that has been done for a long time that are not ratified, and actual ongoing negotiations have been slowing down as well. This will have implications, and of course, Russia, it's not very difficult to decouple from Russia, but as you said in your introduction, if China comes into this as well, this will have great ramifications. There's already a big focus on strategic autonomy, on regional production of chips, rare metals, etc. So we will see where this ends on the short term, but also on the long term. When it comes to the more multilateral system, the EU has always been a very strong defender of WTO, of the multilateral system, of a world order, because that is the way where the EU can orient itself. Now, much of that is falling apart. But we need to be honest, I mean, WTO was in a big crisis long before the Ukraine war. So this is not something, it has been aggravated, but it was in a crisis before for a long time. Now we will have an upcoming ministerial meeting that has been postponed for a long time in June. I wouldn't expect too much to come out of this, maybe some symbolic agreements on health and on some small plurilaterals. Russia has also not
Cecilia, will it even go forward, do you think?
Yes, I think it will, because it has a lot of symbolic decision that they meet indeed. And we need WTO. We need to reform WTO. The biggest problem for the EU has been that there's not enough allies wanting to politically invest in reforming the WTO. There's, the US engagement in reforming WTO has been absent for several years. And if the US now withdraws even further, that will, of course, create some problems. But it's not for the EU, Canada, Australia, and the US that we need WTO. We can make bilateral and regional agreements if we want to. It is for those who are forced to follow the rules: Russia, China, India, and others. Now, this is a problem, of course, and I think we could see more plurilaterals being done among a club of willings, but I don't really see a parallel WTO emerging because of the Russia crisis. Again, it depends very much on how China acts on this. I wouldn't expect much of the ministerial meeting, but I think there will be at least an effort to show that the multilateral system is still working, is there, is alive and kicking, and a few symbolic steps could be taken. If there is a political will, there could be much more happening, but that is not going to emerge right now. But there could be a case for US and EU and others to invest in plurilateral agreements on digital trade, on environmental goods, for instance, and a few others, if there is a willingness to engage. And I doubt that has changed very much, but the crisis was there long before the Ukraine war.
Thank you, Cecilia. That's a good summary of the situation. And Doug, to turn to you now, you're an economist. You're also someone known for writing the history of U.S. trade policy, and I thought you bring us a good historical perspective as well as analysis of kind of the current situation. So on to you.
Sure, and this might be a segue to talking about some of the more systemic effects or longer run effects. So what I think we're seeing in sort of slow motion is sort of the decline, the fraying, the corrosion of a very special 25 years in the history of the world economy. If we think back to the late 1990s, 1985, say, we really literally had three worlds. There was the first world of North America, Western Europe, Japan, and a few others, market-oriented economies, democracies that were the backbone of the GATT. We had the second world of the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, the Soviet bloc, not market-oriented economies and not democratic political systems, obviously. And then we had the third world of South Asia, Africa, Latin America, developing countries that pursued import substitution policies and tried to insulate themselves from the world economy. These three worlds didn't interact very much with one another. The degree of economic integration was very not very tight. And yet, if we fast forward 10 years, by 1995, we have sort of a one world system. We had the Washington consensus sweep the third world. We had the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rush to market-oriented capitalism in the communist world. Even China, they didn't change the political system. They moved towards markets under Deng Xiaoping. And we went from a multilateral system, which I think the GATT was, to a global system under the WTO. One set of rules, all countries were participants. And importantly, politics didn't matter so much. It's not as though this era from 1990 or 1995 for the next 20 years or so was free of conflict. Of course, we had Iraq and Afghanistan, the wars there. We had Bosnia and a few other things. But politics was subdued. And what we've seen since the global financial crisis, and I think Cecilia is absolutely right here, it's not as though the Ukraine war changes everything. There's been a number of signals over the past 10 years that the system is fraying. We had obviously the global financial crisis, which sort of marks a topping off of the extension of global value chains. We had the food price spike that Simon had talked and worked about in 2011, which led to some protectionism. Obviously, we had the Trump trade war and the break with China. Then we have the pandemic. And we have more questions about China and China weaponizing trade for foreign policy reasons against Australia and others that dare to criticize its human rights record. So there's not one event that is sort of tipping the system into a different place, but the system that we had all sort of, I think, hoped for with the WTO is severely frayed. And I think we could stitch together under the WTO so many different economies with very different political systems, with very different foreign policy outlooks, very different value systems, because politics had been sort of ignored or suppressed, or it wasn't a leading problem.
Doug, can I just ask you quickly, wasn't that, I mean, in part what's going on is the disillusionment with what was the theory behind that stitching together of everyone, that, you know, more trade and more economic cross-border investment would inevitably lead major economies towards more democratic and market-oriented systems. And at least in the case of, certainly in the case of Russia and also in the case of China, there's a big disillusionment with that notion that it didn't work that way at all, and that maybe it's gone in the other direction.
Yes, in many developing countries, it actually did work that way, where commerce and moving towards more democratic systems were reinforcing, whether it's Mexico or South Korea, Philippines, and so many other places. But for Russia and China, obviously, and Vietnam, of course, remains to be seen too, although it doesn't look like there's many political changes there. Those political systems are so deeply entrenched that that optimistic story hasn't come to fruition. But I think what we're learning is that it's very difficult to maintain and have deep economic ties and maintain a high level of economic integration with countries that don't get along for political reasons. And so in that sense, it's the return of politics. Now, this is actually, once again, to give a little historical perspective, this goes right back to the end of World War II and the decisions that the US and Western European leaders had to make regarding the GATT. Many people in the United States wanted, and the Roosevelt administration wanted, the ITO, the International Trade Organization, which was truly going to be sort of a pre-WTO. It was going to create a global order like the United Nations. And it was actually Canada and other countries that pulled the US back from that and said, it's very difficult to reach these trade agreements with countries that we have these outstanding political differences from. And that's why we took a step back and opted for the GATT, which is much more of a club of democracies. And if your viewership is interested in this, there's a wonderful book by a historian at the University of Western Ontario called The GATT and the Global Order, which looks at the politics during the GATT era. And if we think it was just all economics and it wasn't politics, this book sort of is a major corrective there. There was a lot of politics in terms of who we let in and what those relations would be. And I think we're back in that world where the political ties are very important determinants of what the economic relationship will be. I think both Cecilia and Simon were sort of right on this in the sense that Russia is only about 3% of world GDP. They're not getting cut off completely. They have to reorient their trade to other countries that are willing to accept their goods. So we're getting a reorientation of trade, not necessarily a huge drop in trade. So it's not deglobalization, but it's a fragmentation of the globalization we've seen over the past. But I think in world historical terms, it's really a unique period, the 1990s and the 2000s. I think we're departing from that period.
So I want to follow up on this. I kind of divided into two pieces here. One is looking at this fragmentation from the standpoint of businesses and what the signals that are being sent to businesses and how they react to all of this right now. Because, some of us here are old enough to remember the period of the 60s and 70s when in that world you were talking about, Doug, before the knitting together, when businesses had major concerns all over the world. You remember political risk insurance was a big part of their business model, expropriations, even wars in regional conflicts. And we've lived in a kind of golden era here where those have been very limited. A lot of the wars were with countries that weren't part of that stitching together. They weren't even WTO members. But now we're in a different environment. So I guess the first question I want to throw out to all three of you is how you see business, coping with this new reality. They don't really know where the system's going long term, but they certainly sense they're living in a much more perilous world, and they've got to figure out how to, this is why the CEO of BlackRock talks about more localization, trends which were already starting because of the trade wars during the Trump administration, and also COVID, which created this greater sense of, a need for autarky, for more localization, for pulling your supply chains in. Public sentiments too about, I saw Catherine Tai testifying on the Hill talking about the way to respond on China is, I think what she said is, vigorously defend our own economic interests, and that starts with rebuilding our domestic industries. So I just wanted to throw that out to you all and see what reaction, and who'd like to start out? Simon, maybe you and then others.
I have two discordant things to say. I mean, the first is, I think you're absolutely right. It's the sequence of these events and the fact that they just keep happening, which is undermining faith. So when I talk to corporate executives and boards, you get the sense that they're just waiting for the next shoe to drop. And the very fact that you can't go before them and say, well, look, that was a crazy time, but it's back to normal business, I think is eroding support for these complex international sourcing strategies. So that's the bad news. The other thing I should say, and then this may be influenced by the fact that I'm located in the German-speaking world. There has been such high levels of investment by German companies in countries like China, less so in Russia, but much more in China, that they are very, very reluctant to move away from that. And so I think this will be a factor which will sort of keep a certain level of ties. Now, you can debate whether those ties should be there, but I do think that some of this is not going to get unwound. So there will be a degree of rollback, I suspect, but some companies will be loath to give up their global strategies, which are based around the fast-growing emerging markets, very few of which have the types of political relationships with the West that are seen as desirable these days.
But Cecilia, you said a lot depends on what China does here, so how China behaves. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because going to Simon's and Doug's point, if we're witnessing a fragmentation, how does China see, handling that in terms of its need for, you compare its 25-year geopolitical alignment with the Soviet Union, that's not how it got to be the number 2 economy in the world. It got to be number 2 with 50 years of increasing economic integration with market democracies.
Indeed. Now we have, on the one hand, lots of companies who have willingly withdrawn from Russia, and who are, of course, looking at when can we come back? Can we ever come back? What's happening with our staff in Russia? With Putin nationalize us? So this will, of course, create, and it is creating a lot of questions within the corporate world today. But on China, which is a much more important market, of course, it is much more complex. And I agree with Simon that many companies would be reluctant to withdraw from that. market. Of course, during the COVID, we have seen some companies, or most companies actually, I mean, trying to be more flexible, diversify their supply chains, building up more resilience, and also looking elsewhere, not to be totally dependent on China on some critical chips and raw materials and some metals and so on. And that is a process that is evolving, but decoupling from Russia is one thing that's quite easy, but from China is much more complex. So I don't see that happening. Then it depends, of course, what's happening in the world. If China more actively enters to support economically and military Russia, there will be secondary sanctions and so on. I think they will do so rhetorically, but not in action. But you know, your guess is as good as mine on this. We don't really know. But I think China will be a bit reluctant to engage too much with Russia on the ground, so to say.
But they may be a bit reluctant to abandon them entirely as well. So they continue on this tightrope. Doug, your thoughts on this? Yeah.
I think to your question, I think there's a new layer of considerations that businesses have to think about as they're considering global trade and investment. So once again, to go back to the period you were talking about, if you're Ford Motor Company and you're making a big investment in Brazil in the 1960s and producing automobiles there, you had to worry about Brazilian economic policy, Brazilian instability, but you didn't have to worry so much about the foreign policy ramifications of that investment. You were selling mainly for the domestic market there, maybe exporting a little bit to other Latin American countries. Now, when you consider investment or trade relationships, it's not only your own country's political risk and their economic policies and whether they're going to interfere with your operations, but is there a chance that the West might fall out with this country for some reason? And obviously, we don't know. Depends on events, obviously, but that's just another layer of complication, I think, that maybe would lead some businesses to think twice about doing things that they wouldn't have thought much about over the past 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, so let's turn now a little bit more on the systemic side to what this means for particularly focusing in on the WTO a little bit. And, obviously that does go to the issues like the relationship of the big democracies with China, but also, obviously the fact that it's an institution where Russia and Ukraine are both members. And if you think about the short-term implications of that in a ministerial meeting, I think it's impossible to keep politics out of it. I was serving in the WTO Secretariat during the second Iraq War, and even then, we're a country that wasn't even part of the system. I remember the disruptions in the business as usual, and I saw that Maria Pagan, who's the new U.S. ambassador to the WTO, said that the MC12, the purpose and objectives of MC12 must be reevaluated in light of the Russia invasion, because, and she borrowed a phrase, obviously, that others have used, no longer business as usual. She said the organization is based on the premise that members will behave civilly and in accordance with international law. So, obviously the climate short term there is going to be very, very difficult. And so I wanted you to sort of maybe start with you, Cecilia, and reflect a little bit on just exactly how much systemic pain is there in a bunch of ministers sitting around in this kind of environment, trying to talk about, fishery subsidies or, making progress on digital trade.
Now, this is going to be very complicated, and it already is. I mean, every day there is work going on in the WTO, and different committees and preparations are ongoing for the ministerial. But of course, coming on the highest level to sit around the same table as someone who represents a government that has been declared a war criminal is going to pose questions in the WTO, as well as G20 and many other of these organizations. So it's not only WTO, but on the other hand, I mean, WTO, as it is today, must keep on working. I mean, the alternative is like if you stop biking, you fall. So it must continue with the ongoing work. There is some important work going on fishery subsidies. There is some work going on patent and waiver, where there is a kind of compromise between the EU, US, China, India, and South Africa. And I think that will go on. Will the summit take place? I actually think so. because it is more important than ever to show that there are some global rules. And if you just dissolve, then you sort of give in to the thought that it's the rule of the jungle.
I agree with that, but let me ask you, Doug, because commenting on what Cecilia said earlier about there may be some efforts at plurilateral arrangements, but a totally separate parallel architecture is probably more difficult and longer term. But I'm interested in your views as an economic historian. I mean, don't you think there's a lot of pressure now for the Western democracies to say we can't really work with, particularly if China stays very, very closely aligned to Russia, we can't really work in this system to create the new rules and norms we want. And in order to create the pressure on them to come kind of back towards a more market-oriented approach, the democracies need to knit together, maybe deeper commitments between each other that are sort of, maybe they sit side by side with the WTO, but they don't depend on WTO consensus to build. And could Europe and the US and Japan and a number of other, like you said, many countries that have now become market-oriented democracies since the 1970s and 80s, how much pressure do you think there is for them to now unify together in some new architecture?
I do worry about the WTO in the medium term and the long run in this dimension. I mean, the US trade policy is at a very interesting point at the moment where it's not doing much. There's no initiative, there's no leadership, but that will come. I mean, these things are cyclical. I think the US is trying to get its head around, in some sense, what it wants. But I think when we do come back to engagement, which I do think will come at some point, when we're ready for that engagement, I'm not sure the WTO will look very palatable to the US, precisely for the reasons you pointed out, is that the difficulty of reaching agreements, the foreign policy and other political differences with countries that are around the table. And to go around that, I mean, it would be a huge undertaking, would be a very long-term undertaking, but something like stitching a TPP and a TTIP together, an alliance of democracies, which you hear about and things of that sort, that would be a long-run move that the US would make, not something obviously we're ready to do now. But I'll just make this one point. So much depends on China. And their future. I mean, we take President Xi as, if he's in there for a long time and that's the new regime, that's a problem. But you do hear reports of debates, because for precisely the reasons you were pointing out, China's prospered under the rules-based international system. And the question is, are they willing to jeopardize that for national security? And when you hear little inklings of a debate within China, I view that as a good sign that we can't write them off and say they're completely off the system in some sense.
Let me go to Simon next, and also you, Cecilia, because this notion that Doug just raised, stitching together TTIP and TPP, or what is now CPTPP. I mean, interestingly enough, I think Cecilia's reaction might be, well, Europe would be much more inclined to go in that direction than the US has been during the last several years. And but first of all, you, Simon, and then Cecilia, for your comments on that thought.
Well, it seems to me, Rufus, that if you want to create that pressure on the non-liberal members, as you might call them, you've got to create a wedge between the Western bloc and the other bloc. And you can do that in two ways. You can either integrate further, which is the TPP, TTIP combination option. But then for that to work, you really have to see an appetite for serious reform, and I'm not sure I see that on either side of the Atlantic. And the other way you can build a wedge between the West and the non-liberal group is by putting up barriers, which is the route which wrecks the WTO. And I fear, I mean, Doug didn't put it like this, and I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but that you could envisage a scenario where a US comes back, looks at the WTO and says, actually, this is a big constraint to creating exactly that wedge and the pressure we need. So I think there's a pessimistic trajectory out there as well. I hope it doesn't come to pass, but it's there.
Cecilia?
I think it is rather pessimistic, actually. Of course, in an ideal world, the US and the EU would jointly join CPTPP and help set common rules and help to set up this as a sort of mini WTO, if you want, in limited, but still very influential. But that is not going to happen. And the US have been very clear they do not want to enter trade agreements under this administration. When it comes to China and WTO, of course, China is a big problem. They are not fulfilling the promises they made, and lots of the blockades are because of them. But I agree with Doug that they had benefited a lot from WTO. And in the investment agreement that the EU and China has concluded, but it's in the freezer because of sanctions and so on. But China actually, at least on paper, commits in legal text to do some of the reforms we've been pushing for them to do in the WTO when it comes to state-owned enterprises and disciplining that, when it comes to forced technology, more transparency, the anti-discrimination and so on. So they do commit, and if they're willing to do that with the EU, they could be willing to do that if there is enough pressure in the WTO as well, because it's the same rules. And China without WTO, they are one of those who would lose the most because they have gained so much. So we need to keep on pushing for China to do some of the reform at the same time as, of course, countries continue to do deals. And if China is not willing to join, so be it. It could be done between a coalition of willing or in a plurilateral form.
Well, but Cecilia, if the coalition of the willing doesn't make a really strong case for the fact that it's willing to go off on its own if China doesn't come along, will China feel that pressure?
Well, it is actually participating in the e-commerce discussions, and it was part of the environmental goods agreement. There were problems there, have been in all these negotiations, but it's theoretically not impossible. They would gain a lot from it as well.
Let me read you all something. Catherine Tai testified yesterday, and I think she's testifying actually as we're speaking now on the Senate side. She testified yesterday in the House. And what the big message on China was that the United States is ready to turn the page on the old playbook on China, basically saying that the old playbook focused on changing China's behavior. This goes back to the point I was making to you earlier, Doug, about the belief that getting them into the system would, make everybody, peace-loving Democrats who wanted to have market economies. And she says, now we're focused on vigorously defending our own interests, including by rebuilding America. And that's really the question I wanted to ask is, are the pressures for going towards more nationalistic approaches towards your economy rather than, any of these new alignments, are they so great that we're really going to see the fragmentation without any kind of replacement through, free trade models? Doug, you want to take that on?
Oh, Simon unmuted first. Why don't we, Simon, and then I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Simon.
Thanks. It's true that we may have wanted the WTO to provide this trajectory for countries to become more liberal over time in terms of their economics and politics. But even if we can't get that, and we do have a bit of fragmentation, there's still an important role for the WTO as a way of trying to help manage and limit trade tensions. And that's exactly why we need to have conversations around e-commerce, around corporate subsidies and the like. And this is why I think some of the signals coming out of Beijing, which evidently Doug's picked up on and Cecilia's mentioned, these are signals which we ought to be responding to in a positive way to find out, maybe we can create a system which at least sort of shaves off the rough edges of this fragmentation.
Doug?
Yeah, just in terms of the fragmentation of the WTO and the US, considers becoming a global leader again. What's striking about the Ukraine issue is the number of countries just willing to say, okay, we're not going to give MFN to Russia anymore. So I see that both as a positive and a negative. One is it is a response, obviously, to the huge crisis there. But also, if that's what you can do, just literally declare unilaterally you're not going to apply MFN to a country, that really shatters the framework in some sense. The US could do that regarding China, apparently, if that's sort of an open door using national security in that way. So I think it's some very, very difficult choice. I mean, one point you raised, here's where, once again, sort of it depends on what happens in China and to Russia to some extent. If China goes in an increasingly nationalist direction, that creates a threat to the West, and that will unite them in terms of trade. So you said there's no appetite for liberalization. Well, when there's an external threat, that can create an appetite. If China is sort of bouncing back and forth, and there's a nationalist faction and a more open faction, they're sort of fighting, we're sort of not really resolving that, then I think you're right. The appetite will not be there for further reform, and obviously we won't necessarily pull out completely from China. So it'll be sort of, we'll be muddling along, if you will. So a lot of this is just depends on China's choices to some extent, and because our appetite for trade liberalization is endogenous in some sense to the global environment.
Yeah, you know, it's been interesting to watch, because Biden certainly hasn't talked about China in the same way Trump did by any means, in terms of, you know, trying to describe it as the, you know, inevitable, you know, both economic and security threat to the United States. He's muted that somewhat, and they talked a lot about China's practices and policies. But I wonder whether that goes to the question of the realization that which way this goes with respect to China's relationship with the West has a huge impact on you know, the future of an open world economy. I wonder if Ken, are you ready to come back in with some audience participation here?
Thanks, Rufus, and thank you for the really interesting conversation we've been having, really spurring personally a lot of thoughts, and I'm sure for our audience as well. Interestingly, so I'm going to try to tie a few of the questions together that have come in. We've talked a lot on this discussion today about China and the WTO. That's a conversation we could have been having even if Russia had not invaded Ukraine 6 weeks ago. But it also highlights, the past 6 weeks have highlighted the issue of countries that we are not politically aligned with, in the case of China, kind of going their own way as related to the sanctions. Same with some other countries. And we have three of the questions that have come in, including from a friend of ours, Elaine Feldman, who many of you may know from Canada. You know, where do we see India in all this? Traditionally, it has been, it has blocked progress in the WTO and is in some measure now benefiting from the Ukraine situation by buying Russian exports at cheaper prices. So how do we balance that, you know, countries like India and many of the others in the WTO currently who aren't taking part in the Western sanction regime that is taking place? Anyone, Cecilia, I see you nodding a bit. I don't know if you want to jump in on India and some of these other countries who are not as politically aligned with the Western countries on their approach to Russia.
Well, India is very interesting, and it's very hard to see where it's going. It's operating a little bit. I mean, this is a huge country with supposedly, at least has built up good friendship with the US, and it has been on its way with the EU, and now it's sort of moving under the radar and hoping for the chaos to blow away without anybody noticing. But it is remarkable that this country, who names itself the biggest democracy in the world, is not participating in the sanctions, but also not condemning, even if it abstained in the United Nations vote. It didn't vote no, it abstained. But I think they hope they will not take part. I don't think we can push them to do that. At best, to play a very discreet role, but they have close ties with Russia, and they want to maintain them. But then, of course, they have their issues with China as well. So they're squeezed between a rock and a hard place in that regard. One would have hoped also that countries such as South Africa, Brazil, and others would have spoken up more clearly, but I don't see that happening. I don't think it's going to change, unfortunately, depending, of course, how much brutal this war can get. If we see even more civilians dying, even more bombing of hospitals, schools, etc., and this is being broadcast, some countries will be pressured also by their citizens. But so far, I think they will not move.
Doug, did you want to jump in on that at all, or anyone else? Simon, I think one of the other So again, following up on a similar theme, and this does go to a point Doug raised at the beginning. Doug, I hadn't really thought of trade agreements really as, and you didn't say it exactly this way, but there's sort of a political consensus, it sounds like, that precedes a trade agreement, whether it needs to be, there need to be political reasons between nation states for them to decide to then follow a trade arrangement, to create trade arrangements that support or enhance that political arrangement that they have. And we're also, one of the questions, some of the questions that come in relate to that. Really, are we at this pivot point? Is there an inflection point where we really are going to be pivoting to not a GATT system, but at least it sounds like the GATT premise was based on a political consensus among the Western democracies and countries, like Japan and others who were aligned politically. And doesn't also a domestic political consensus need to precede some of these trade arrangements as well? They don't follow the trade arrangements. Sometimes they must seem to have to precede them. So do we have to really do a lot of housekeeping both in our domestic and international political relations before we're able to reform some of these trade systems?
This would be a simplification to some extent, but I think a useful one. When you look at US activism in terms of trade leadership, where does it come from? Often it has come from perceived external threats or external problems that have to be solved. It's not like there's this domestic swelling saying, let's lead and let's open up our economy and lead others in doing that. So when we look at the first GATT, that was the one where actually there was a domestic consensus that we need to open the world and avoid a Great Depression again. And fight fascism. And so it was that view that we need to shape the world environment to make it safe for us. When we look at the Kennedy round, we thank the European Economic Community for that, because that was not really a threat, but it was viewed as that's affecting our commercial interests in such a large way that we have to reduce the barriers to reduce that external tariff wall of the EEC. When we look at the Uruguay round, once again, that's a reaction to the 1970s and 80s and the deterioration of the environment for US agricultural exports, the rise of subsidies, the view that the GATT was too weak and the rules weren't being enforced, and so why should we have it? So once again, it was a response to external events. Now, this is not to say that things have to get worse before they get better, or they have to get worse to stimulate the US to do something, because once again, neither party is really proposing at this point some sort of major US global initiative, or at least among democracies or some partial partners. And I think that's where it depends on what happens in China and elsewhere. If that external threat environment seems to get worse, I think that will bring the Western countries together. But otherwise, we're in sort of this holding pattern where not much is getting done. It's hard to see where the will to liberalize, or the will to accept for some of these piecemeal agreements, where that comes from, unless the international environment changes in a big way.
So in following up on that, and things like the technology council that's being developed between the US and EU. Cecilia, I see you're ready to jump in here. Does that create some opportunities for partnerships?
I was just going to say that, because I also don't think we have an environment where big, grandiose trade agreements are on the table. But doing a few very concrete things that are visible and that brings mutual benefits to partners could be done. And the Trade and Technology Council could be such a forum. We've just seen that preparations for the next high-level meeting in May are ongoing. We saw the creation of an Energy Security Council, which is linked to that, and there will be increased trade of LNG from US to Europe. There is a discussion on some standards. This sounds very boring, but all trade nerds, we know that standards are really key, and it's a question of being standard setter and not standard taker. And there, Europe and US can do something together. And also there are discussions about artificial intelligence, about digital trade, about certain norms, about chips, semiconductors, and so on. So it could actually be something where not big headline things happen, but a few small things that builds trust and that see to business and citizens on both sides of the pond that this is actually useful. And I think the conditions for that have improved even further during this terrible crisis. And then China comes in, of course, as well on this. There is increased alignment, even if the rhetoric is not exactly the same. There is increased alignment on how to deal with China when it comes to labor rights, when it comes to due diligence, and so on.
So that bring back China, and I'm going to circle back to China in a minute. So by the way, the last question about the TTC came from our good friend Alan Wolf, former Deputy Director General of the WTO, who is on the session today. Alan, even though I can't see you, glad to know you're here with us. So another friend of some of ours, Dan Pearson, has an interesting question. It sort of follows up a little bit on this. I'll try to read it maybe directly. In the event democracies were to create some new alignment with each other for purposes of trade, for example, some sorts of combinations of TTIP and TPP, which was presented, is it possible for the WTO to still exist and serve a useful purpose in providing an opportunity, with the dispute settlement and the DSU were to get reinvigorated, or are the interests, or are we envisioning a world where we're moving beyond the WTO into creating some new sort of structures of the politically aligned? Simon.
So Ken, I think there is still a future for the WTO in that world, but it's a different one than one we created with the Uruguay round. It would be a WTO which is much more about confidence building through transparency, through deliberation. It would be one which thought harder about how to manage the disruption and trade tensions between different types of capitalism. So there's a future based around those issues, rather than just the straight liberalization agenda, which was, of course, very valuable. But I guess the key point I would make is the WTO doesn't just have to be about rounds and liberalization. It could do so much more.
And I'm going to bring it back. Thank you, Simon. Back to China. Is there we've sort of talked about it in a negative sense, but is there a positive opportunity for China to engage at the WTO and elsewhere on some of these, if we're headed towards more smaller arrangements that are aligned around mutual interests? Are there some opportunities to positively engage China in a way that would keep it engaged in a larger multilateral system? Cecilia.
I think within the climate and environment section there is, because this is a problem in China as well. This is a debate. This is something that is of great concern to Chinese citizens. They can talk about these issues freely, and this could be a way where you could bridge some differences to focus on climate issues. You could bring back the environmental goods agreement negotiations, or you could speed it up or update it or version 2 or whatever. But this would be an issue where I actually think that China would be ready to engage, and that would be trust building, but also something really beneficial. There was this small but still agreement in the Glasgow summit between the US and China to do certain things together on climate. So I mean, there is a readiness, I think, to engage in that.
Very good. Well, thank you. Well, see, we try to find some positive ways to wrap up. We are right at close to the bewitching hour. Rufus, I see you've unmuted your line. Do you want to say any final words? And I want to ask Doug, Cecilia, Simon, if any of you have any closing thoughts before we end today's really interesting session that I think has raised as many questions as we've answered. But Rufus.
Well, Ken, first of all, thanks to all three panelists. A great conversation between you. And myself personally, obviously somebody who's been involved in the WTO system for a long time, since its inception, I tend to agree with both Simon and Cecilia that the WTO will continue to be something that is needed. I'm convinced that particularly the US and Europe need to lead the way on how we avoid new forms of nationalism and protectionism. I'm worried about digital, for example, where the EU is going forward with a whole bunch of new things. The US is in a somewhat different position, and the two need to work in an area like that as well as traditional areas. And that will help to knit together the democratic countries if we can. I'm all for looking at ways of moving towards some kind of super TTIP, TPP, but I realize politically how difficult that is. But even with that, as a parallel architecture, there will be a value in the WTO, largely because where would China and the rest of the developing world besides Russia? Think of Africa, think of Latin America. You know, we have to have a platform for engagement with them. If we move to a strictly a kind of a club of the advanced democracies and a few Asian, economies, that's not going to be good for the world long term. So, but I think we've had a great discussion. It obviously introduces a whole number of thoughts about the future, and none of us really know where it's going. So I hope we keep up with sessions like this.
Thank you very much, Rufus. Thanks for those words of wisdom. You are always someone I touch base with on all these matters. Really grateful to you. Doug, real pleasure to finally have you on. I hope I can drag you back sometime. Cecilia, I need to tell all our folks here, Cecilia's actually in Washington. And if I had known that well in advance, maybe we'd have tried to have done a session in person. But when we scheduled this, we did it for an online session. And but really pleased to have you on. Hope to have you on again. Continue this really important discussion. Simon, pleasure to have you back as well. Thank you so much. Everyone, please take care of yourself. Rufus, thanks again for moderating and all your work helping get this session off the ground. Thanks to all of you. I've put a link back to our the work we're trying to do to help support World Central Kitchen's relief efforts in Ukraine. If you'd like to contribute to that, please do so. We'll keep that linked on our website as well. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. Thank you to our panelists, and we look forward to seeing you next week when we talk about food security coming out of the war in Ukraine, and then energy issues the week after that. Thank you all very much.